Well, thank you, Kim. She kind of stole my thunder. I was going to talk a little bit about that we were in Mrs. Owens' kindergarten class in East Dixon Elementary, which no longer exists, right? So, but anyway, um, Kim has been asking me to share something about the Nishikawa family for a couple of years now, and I've put her off and put her off, told her how busy I am, and I told her I don't have anything to talk about. What do people want to know? And we would just talk on the phone like we normally do, and I would tell her little things about my family's experience and questions that she had, and she just kept on reassuring me that that's good enough. So anyway, when I compare my our history to the Schroeders, a family that has been here since the 1800s, and my family was only here for about 35 years, and I feel like we're almost like carpetbaggers. We we came here. We were very successful, and we moved on. My aunt Carol Fukumoto was the last of our family to live here in Dixon, and she moved away April of 2023 um, to live with her daughter in Oakland. And sadly, she just passed away this last June. But she was 95, and she was the last of my parents' generation, or at least of the Nishikawa side. So, you know, when you look at the Nishikawas and our history here in California, it started back in 1915. My grandfather, his name is Kurakichi Nishikawa. Um, he was working for a textile company in Japan, and he visited the United States for the first time to visit the World's Fair in San Francisco in that year. And he was so amazed with this country and I guess just the vast opportunities and the land and the people. And he, you know, decided to come here. In Japan, just like in many cultures, if you are not the first son, you don't have a lot of opportunity in your home, in your native country. The first son inherits everything. And yes, Chinese culture is the same. Um, and so my grandfather was not the first son. Matter of fact, he wasn't even a Nishikawa. My his his family name was actually Oshika, and I think the way the story goes, and Jeff can correct me, um, is that our cousins were the Nishikawas, and they didn't have a son. And so my grandfather was adopted on paper by the Nishikawas to carry their line. And, which I always find kind of funny, you know, because after all, my poor wife, you know, my grandfather had two sons, right? My older uncle, my uncle Hiro, had three sons, and they didn't have any. There's only one grandchild on that side of the Nishikawa family, and so my poor wife, she's married to me, the only son of Yutaka Nishikawa, and she feels all this pressure to have a son, because after all, my dad would go visit her and at her dry cleaners in Elk Grove, and he would say to her, you know, I have, and those of you who know my dad know Utah Nishikawa. You can imagine this, right? He'd be, I have seven grandkids right now, and none of them are Nishikawas, right? So my poor wife, I think we'd only been married a couple of months, and he's already digging into her. And 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 so one morning I remember laying in bed sleeping, and all of a sudden I hear somebody going, "I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you did this." And I'm feeling a fist hitting me in the back, and she's kicking me, and I'm like, "What the heck's going on?" And and she wakes up and she tells me that I left her because she couldn't have a son. And this is like 5 in the morning, so I at least waited till about 8, and then I called my parents and I said, "Do not talk to my wife about having children anymore. That's the end of this." So anyway, so Kurakichi came here in the United States in 1919. At the time he left 2 daughters in Japan. I don't think his intention was to stay in the United States forever. At least the story goes is that he thought he'd come here, he'd farm, make some money, and go back to Japan. Because after all, he's not the oldest son. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. So he saw opportunity here. And of course, he brought his wife. They had 5 children here, which I always find kind of funny. If you're not going to stay in the United States forever, why do you have 5 children? But they started in Liberty Island in Moortrack area in the Delta. My grandfather worked for a Japanese farmer named George Shima for a few years. He was, I think he's known as being like one of the first millionaires in California that was of Japanese descent. And so, he learned how to farm from him. And he was able to lease his own property and farm. Sadly, in the 1920s, people of Asian descent could not own land. Well, let me back that up. We couldn't become citizens either, okay? And you needed to be a citizen in order to buy land. So it was kind of a little trick in the law, the way things were. And I believe these laws existed until the 1950s. But so my grandfather never purchased land before World War II. My grandfather was very, I would say he was very proud of being Japanese, even to the point where he really didn't trust American banks. And this definitely cost our family, because prior to World War II, my grandfather was doing pretty well as a farmer, and any money that he had saved, and he was here over 20 years, he would convert to yen and send it back to Japan and put it in Japanese banks. And so those of you who might remember what exchange rates were back in the 1940s, my dad describes it almost like what the euro is, is like $1 or $2 to the yen. And so if you have all your money in yen, and then during the war you have no access to your assets, by the time the war ended, I think the exchange rate, as my dad describes it, was about 360 yen to a dollar. So, my family was financially kind of destitute. I mean, we really had to start all over again in 1945. Even to the point where, like Jeff's mother, my Auntie Margaret, and a couple of their sisters, they used to work as as domestic helpers for families in San Francisco. And, they get free room and board, and they could study and all that kind of stuff. During World War II, after World War II, the only thing I'll really say about that is, number one, my family never really spoke about their experiences during World War II. This was a very troubling time for them. The things I've learned are things I've had to learn on my own, because it wasn't something that my dad ever talked about. My mother, on the other hand, she was 9 years old when World War II broke out. And in many ways, she enjoyed being in the internment camps. And the reason why is because she was around all her friends. She was around a lot of other Japanese families. And she was away from some of the discrimination. Because if you can imagine, you go to school one day and you're just a kid, and then Pearl Harbor occurs, and then you go to school the following week, and now you're the enemy. My mom used to say that, kids used to call her a baby-faced Jap. And, so when Executive Order 9066 was signed in 1942, it gave the military the ability to isolate the areas of militarized zones, right? So that enemy aliens couldn't be living in those areas around like bases. And at first it was maybe, a few mile radius around a base. But then they expanded that authority and they made it the entire state of California, Oregon, and Washington. People who are considered enemy aliens. And, and so what ended up happening is 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry that lived in those states were removed from their home. And this occurred in about April 1942. And, there's talk, I think my family went to, the Modesto Assembly Center, which was basically like going to a fairground and having to be housed in in a horse stall until they figured out what to do with these people. My dad's family ended up in Gila River in Arizona, but eventually ended up in Tule Lake. Tule Lake, the 14,000 people who ended up in Tule Lake are considered the ones who are disloyal. Because after all, of the 110,000, 2/3 are American citizens. And something to remember is that families were displaced and, they were never asked, or there was never real evidence any of these people had anything to do with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or any of that, right? They're just people living in California, farming, trying to make a living. And, but after you remove them from their homes, the Japanese had to do these loyalty surveys. And as my dad put it, he answered no on whether or not he would disavow the Empire of Japan and express loyalty to the United States. He answered no to that question. And then the last question was, would you be willing to serve your country? And my father answered no again. So these Japanese were considered no-nos. these Japanese were considered disloyal. And like I said, of the 110,000, about 14,000 were considered no-nos. My dad likes to think that that number would have been higher because after all, if you're asked by your country if whether or not you're loyal, how many people just answer yes because they figure it's what they want to hear? My dad was very principled, and he felt like, you've already displaced me from my home. Why don't you ask me that question before? You know, so that's how he answered that question. You know, something I didn't mention either, since we're mainly talking about the Nishikawas. My mother grew up in Penryn. Her maiden name is Tenma, and my grandfather on that side of the family was arrested by the FBI in, I'm not exactly sure when, probably February of 1942. And he was held at a federal prison in Oklahoma for approximately 9 months. And, you know, so my grandmother, who didn't speak English, had to move her family and prepare to move, you know, with, 4 children, one as young as 2, you know, in a country she doesn't speak the language, and get rid of some of their possessions, and, you know, leave their home with just what they could carry. And, but it was, you know, my mother's family was like my father's. They were no-nos. They actually met each other at Tule Lake. My grandfathers knew each other. And it's interesting. I often, you know, I often joke about when I was growing up here in Dixon, and people, you know, girls would ask me out or whatever, and I used to tell them that, well, I'm supposed to marry a Japanese girl. So I can't get too serious, but what was funny about that is that my mother's family was so conservative. They wanted their children not just to marry Japanese, they wanted them to marry Japanese from Hiroshima. They wanted to be able to, like, contact family in Hiroshima and, like, get the lowdown on who are these people. And it was that experience at Tule Lake where my grandfathers met each other, that when my father had the opportunity to date my mother, and what's interesting about them is that my cousin Jeff, this is my cousin Jeff, by the way, his grandfather actually introduced my mother and my father. My dad used to call it a baishakunin, which is kind of like a matchmaker or go-between, as he put it. And so my father was given my mother's name and number, and was introduced to her. And it was Jeff's grandfather that made this arrangement. They knew the families, and my mother's father agreed to this only because he knew Kurakichi Nishikawa from their experience at Tule Lake. You know, during the time at Tule Lake, there's another thing that you should probably know. During that time, the military had given the impression to a lot of the people there that if they were willing to give up their citizenship, that they would trade them for American POWs, and it was a chance to go back to Japan. My father's family had 2 daughters in Japan that were being raised by their grandparents. And so they looked at it as an opportunity to maybe get out of this place early, to leave Tule Lake early and go back to Japan. Because, let's face it, it didn't look good. If this is how we're going to be treated, then we decided that we should leave. So my father and his siblings that were over 18 gave up their citizenship. But sadly, because think about it this way, the military in Japan did not view people living in America who are of Japanese descent, they didn't view them as being Japanese. They're American. They live in America. Right? So why would we give up American soldiers for these people? Some of them are women and children. So there wasn't a lot of logic to this theory, and so it never occurred. So here, World War II ends, and those who are legal immigrants, like my grandparents, they're released to go home. My aunts and a couple of my aunts who were not 18, they were able to go because they're American citizen. But my father, his mother, my other aunt and my Uncle Hiro, they're no longer citizens. They've just given up their citizenship. And the military didn't know what to do with these people. So my family, parts of my family, stayed in camp until, I believe, April of 46, until they finally decided to just let them go. Because they didn't know what to do with these people. They're not legal immigrants. They're not citizens. They're not citizens of Japan. Japan doesn't want them. What do we do with these people? So there were approximately 6,500 people at Tule Lake of the 14,000 that gave up their citizenship. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of those people were activists. They were pro-Japanese. Okay, there was some of that going on, but not my family. My family just wanted to get out of the place, right? So, anyway, my family returned to Moore Track area and farmed at Liberty Island. My dad got his citizenship back by 1951 and promptly was drafted to serve the U.S. Army and serve in Korea. My dad thought about being a draft dodger, by the way. He really did. Because how frustrating and angry you could be. Because less than 10 years earlier, you're an enemy alien. You're not even considered an American, right? And then now you're a loyal citizen and you're being called upon to serve your country, a country that took away your liberties. My dad was ready to leave. My dad was not happy about this. But it was his father, my grandfather, who told him that if you choose to live in a country, you have to be willing to die for that country. My grandfather served in the Japanese army. He served during the Japanese-Russo War, and he knew what it was like. He knew what it was like to serve. He knew the honor and obligation you have to a country. And that's what he advised my father. So reluctantly, my father served. You know, my dad was supposed to be, frontline infantry. And as he was traveling in a transport to Korea, he happened upon some other Japanese American soldiers. And he finds out that they're going to, go to Japan to study Japanese for 6 months. And they're going to be interpreters. They're going to work for military intelligence because at the time, most Koreans spoke Japanese. So, so whether you spoke Korean or you spoke Japanese, you were a valuable asset to military intelligence. And my dad's talking to these other soldiers, and he realizes he knows Japanese better than these guys. And so he begged his CO to find out if they need more interpreters. And, and so he did make the call. He found out that he would be given one opportunity to take a test to see if, how competent he was in Japanese, and that, he might have an opportunity to study Japanese for 6 months. My dad did so well on that test that he immediately went into military intelligence, was transferred to military intelligence, and went to front lines in Korea and served as a interpreter, interrogating POWs and that sort of thing. And that's how he served his 2 years during the Korean War. When I was a teenager, I used to love to tell my dad. I used to tell my dad that, maybe it was a good thing. Maybe it was a good thing you were interned during World War II because you were motivated to study Japanese because he thought he was going to go back to Japan. And, and it might have saved you because you were supposed to be on the front line. You were supposed to be in an infantry unit. You were supposed to be fighting. And you ended up being in a military intelligence unit. And I used to tease him about that. And of course, my dad told me I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. But that's the type of, I guess that's the type of teenager I used to be. But, my dad, during this time, we were farming in Liberty Island. And, my uncle and him were farming together. They knew that they didn't have much opportunity there. Matter of fact, it's kind of ironic that here, my Uncle Hiro is holding down the business while his brother is serving in a foreign war. And, he finds out that, the Miguel family, this Filipino family that's farming next door to us, is paying less for their land than us. And, and when my uncle approached our landlord as to why are you charging us more? And he just gave him the answer, I don't know. But we knew why. And my uncle said, well, when is this discrimination going to end? And the landlord said, I don't know. And he said, I'll tell you, it's going to end now. And it was at that moment that my uncle began to move our operation out here to the valley, out here to Dixon. I told Kim that we ended up in Dixon because families here in this community were willing to sell land to Japanese farmers. There are several Japanese farmers that farmed in this area. We weren't the only ones. There was the Shigakis, there was the Saitos, there was the Nishimuras, Saito. Saito. No, but I know. Saito. I get it. But yeah, there were several. And they came here because the community was willing to work with us. We used to, there are land that we purchased from various families here, and, like the Glides and the Sawyers. We used to lease land from the Fountains, and we used to refer to those properties by those names. And it kind of, in a way, it honored the people that were willing to sell to us. Our home ranch was on Vaughn Road. It's now an industrial site. We're probably the reason why, but we used to own almost 300 acres on the corner of Vaughn Road and First Street, the northeastern corner from there to the railroad tracks. And that's where we got started. We purchased that land in 1955. My uncle built his home there. My cousins told me that they started going to school here in Dixon in 1957. My cousin David, Jerry, Patty, Sharon, Mark. Those were my Uncle Hiro's children. There's a picture here that shows the property in 1965. My parents built their house in 1962. And then, there's another picture here of our property in 1989. Something I'll tell you about my dad. My dad was, we often called him he was often known to be very thrifty. And, he, I don't know. When I was a little kid, I used to think he was kind of miserly. But, the one thing I can say about him is that he, and I'm a financial advisor. I've probably interviewed a couple thousand people about their finances. And in all the years that I've dealt with people, I've never met anyone that never had a mortgage. And don't get me wrong, we borrowed money to buy land. But my dad built his house in Dixon in cash. And in 91, when he built his house in Davis, he built it in cash. He never had a mortgage because it was very important to him that he never would put, his home at risk. Losing his home was, something that he could not risk. At one point in time, I think Nishikawa Farms, we used to farm about 6,000 acres here in the Dixon-Davis area. We used to extend as far as Madison. We owned about half of those acres. In the 1970s, it's interesting. We became the only unionized farm in this area, and I think the only unionized farm in Northern California. I'm really not sure. It wasn't by choice. It wasn't by choice, I will tell you that. My father used to be very bitter over this, and a lot of times he used to think that it might have been racially motivated. Why are you picking on us? We're not the biggest farm. Why are you picking on us? You know, sometimes I used to think it was my dad. You know, my dad, his responsibility in the operation was to focus on the production side. So he oversaw all of our employees. And I know he was a tough guy to work for. So sometimes I wonder the real motivation, you know. Um, you know, my dad, was known as being very honest, but at the same token, he was a tough guy. He demanded a lot. And I used to kind of wonder why. Why did you demand so much of our employees? They're just employees. And I think it's because he started off as a farm laborer in the 50s or late 40s after World War II. And what really got us ahead is not because he worked so hard. He did work hard. Him and my uncle they would drive trucks at night. They'd work 10 hours in the fields, and then they would drive trucks at night taking produce to Oakland. And the biggest financial move that they made during that time is they bought their first truck. And they borrowed money to borrow that truck. And my grandfather thought they were crazy to do that because, after all, most Japanese buy things in cash. And that was the first big risk that they took. And, because they wanted to, own it so that they weren't having to lease a truck, right? And that's how my dad operated. That's how we got ahead. We did everything on our farm, everything from the groundwork to the planting to the harvesting. We did a lot of our own trucking. I think at one time we were the largest tomato grower for Campbell's Soup here for the Dixon Cannery. That was something that I know that my father was very, very proud of. Because, they worked that hard to get that ahead. And so despite the fact that we were paying, we're paying $5 an hour and providing benefits at a time when minimum wage was maybe $3.25, we still got ahead. It's something that is a legacy that my father wanted to be not remembered for, but wanted that his family to be appreciative. I'm the benefactor of my father's sacrifice. My children are the benefactors of my father's sacrifice. My dad didn't really have any hobbies. His life was farming. His life was being successful here. And, and it was sad because, when I was 11 years old, and I still remember this because I was at C.A. Jacobs, and Doug Elf was my social studies teacher. For those of you who know Mr. Elf. And it was about this time of year. It was October of that year, about 45 years ago. My cousin Jerry, who was working for the family at the time, was injured helping my uncle with their corn harvest. And I think we had an early rain, and they had a grain trailer that sank in the mud, and they were trying to get it out of the mud that night on a Friday night, and they had an accident. and my cousin was injured, and now he's a paraplegic. I was 11. It's kind of funny because, well, it's kind of silly because I remember doing a current event report in Mr. L's class, and this is what I chose to talk about. And I remember the look on Mr. L's face because I didn't realize at the time that he had played football with Jerry and that he knew him really well, and how much that shook him up. It was probably one of the only times I ever saw my dad cry, because something that had been so good to our family, really changed the course of our family. I was supposed to come back to the farm. That was my destination. I was told that from the time I was a little kid. It was my responsibility. But when I was 11, that's when I was told that there are easier ways to make a living. That's what my dad used to say, right? I think anybody who have ever had immigrant parents or parents who struggle financially, they will always tell you that, right? There are easier ways to make a living. Don't do it this way, And, but anyway, so yeah, I didn't go into farming, and our history here is changed. In the 80s, my parents worked with Ed McDonald, and he helped them get their property out of the Williamson Act, and he got it annexed into the city, and it gave us the opportunity to sell it to Carl Panettone, and now there's that industrial area on Vaughn Road. I often drive by, and it kind of stings to not be able to see your childhood home, that it's all concrete and there's a warehouse there. And actually, to make it worse is, I think when was that, Jeannie? 93? Yeah. In 93, they donated our houses to the Solano Fire District, and they did training there, and they burned down our house. and I had known about this, and I happened to be at my wife's parents' house, and they had the news on, and they're showing this on the news. And I'm looking at it, seeing flames coming out of a bedroom window, and I'm looking at it going, I think that's my bedroom. But, and that was the end of our time here, We retired from farming in 1991. And I still remember that day, that fall, when we had our auction. We hired Martel or whatever, and they came out, and I've never seen our equipment look so organized. And they drove around, and lot by lot, everything got auctioned away, and by that afternoon, everything was gone. This photo here shows our shop, the blue metal shop that is now on Pedrick Road. I think there's a truck repair shop over there that bought it, and they moved it over there. I think that's the only remnant of what used to be our farm. And because, yeah, it was all gone. You know, I've since that time, you know, I've converted most of our assets into commercial assets. We still have Sawyer Ranch that my wife is, she won't let me sell it. Supposedly, she wants to build a home out there, so I might be moving back to Dixon, I guess. But anyway, that's, you know, there were, what, nine kids that came through the Dixon schools that were Nishikawas. I graduated in 1986, and all of us are gone. Granted, most of us live in Davis, so we're not that far away. But yeah, we still own property on Pedrick Road by Pewter Creek. My cousin Mark is still involved with the Cooley family, and they farm together, and they also run Cool Ranch or Cool Patch together. So they are still around. So yeah, I think so. We're kind of this, or at least my cousin Mark is kind of the silent partner to that. But I don't know. That's basically that's our time here. Anyone have any questions or anything? I don't know.
Could you explain some of the photos that you have presented for us here?
Oh.
You explained some, but there were some others.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is my grandfather Kurakichi and his wife Yone. You know, my grandfather died in 1956. My father was married in 57. My dad spent the last 4 years of his father's life helping, you know, take care of his dad. So I never knew my grandmother. My grandmother Yone used to live in the house that was between my dad and uncle's house. There was an original house in Dixon, this property here, or this house here, where my grandmother lived. And then my Uncle Hiro's house was here, and then our house was on the other side. And again, this was about 1965, since this house was built in 62. There was a bonsai tree that was planted by my maternal grandfather, my mother's father. He was a master in bonsai. I used to marvel over the fact that he could grow trees sideways and have the limbs look like miniature trees. And he was one of the founders of the Placer Bonsai Club, which is one of the reasons why I believe that he was targeted by the FBI. Because many of the leaders, church leaders, bonsai leaders that were up in that area were all arrested. This tree that my grandfather planted in front of our house in Dixon now is in front of my parents' house in Davis. My dad built a house there in '93, and he transplanted this thing for my mother, along with a lot of the cobble and rocks that were in front of this house, or in front of our house in Dixon, because those stones were taken from my mother's family property up in the Newcastle Placer area. So, yeah, so I mean, those are some of the, I don't know, memories or some of the things that kind of connect me to my grandparents on my mother's side. This is a photo taken, I believe, in 1930, or at least I guess 1930, given that this is Carol Fukumoto, by the way. And she, you know, she's in her mom's arms, and she, you know, is just a baby. This is my dad, and this is Hiro. And then my Auntie Margaret, Jeff's mom, is here, and then my Auntie Sumi, who lived in Lodi. So like I said, this was in 1930. This is a picture of my dad and his siblings, and I believe it's around 1982. And Hiro, my dad, Carol, my Auntie Sumi, my Auntie Margaret, and this is my Auntie Terue. So she's from Japan. So she never left Japan. And during the Korean War, when he would go on leave, he would go to Japan, and he visited his sister for the first time. So he was, you know, that was like 1951, 52 was the first time he met his sister. Oh, this is a picture of my family from, I think it's 81, and I'm only judging that by what I'm wearing. But anyway, so it's 1981, this is in our home in Dixon, and I have three sisters, Suzanne, who graduated in 83, Elaine, who graduated in 80, and my sister Brenda, who graduated in 78.
78, yep.
Oh, and I brought some pictures of my mom's family. This is my mom's family. My grandfather, Itsuo Tenma, and my grandmother, Tomito, my uncle Shoki, my mom, Sakaya, her sister, Ruth, her sister, Yayoi, and then her sister, Kaz. And then this is my cousin, Irene. So she was the first grandchild on that side. And then this was taken, I think it was taken in 1971. So I was 3 in this picture, and this is my mom's side of the family. This was for my grandparents' 50th anniversary. So, yes, sir.
The question about your relatives that were put in the internment camps, at about the time that happened, was any of their property ever seized, confiscated, and also, or were they forced to sell certain things at a terrific discount or something?
Oh, sure. Yeah, my mom always talks about how we had a brand new car, or they had just bought a brand new car that my grandfather was very proud of, and my grandmother had to sell it and get rid of it. You know, unfortunately, we weren't like some families, primarily because the children weren't old enough. But some Japanese families, because of birthright citizenship, your children are citizens, right? So by the time they turn 18, they could purchase land, right? But my aunts and uncles weren't quite old enough. And so we weren't in that situation. But that is a true situation. But, you know, with all that, there are stories, and even as close as the Dutra Bend area and in the Pocket in Sacramento, you'll hear of stories of Portuguese families that would farm land for their neighbors, their Japanese neighbors who were interned, and that they were honest enough to hold the money for them. There are stories like that, you know. You just don't hear about it too often. Yeah. And that wasn't my hard case. You know, my mom would always talk about that the struggles that we had in America, you know, whether it was, you know, whenever you're trying to get ahead, she talks about as a child that they had a fire and they lost everything, right? And then I think my grandmother got sick and they had these big medical bills, and that set them back. And then World War II happened. And so even though their intention was never to stay here permanently, all of these little setbacks is what kept us here. When after World War II in '45, my family, the Nishikawa side of the family, thought about going back to Japan. But my grandparents, who were already taking care of my great-grandparents, were already taking care of two of my aunts. They said not to come. They said that things are too tough. There's not enough food for them. How are you going to come here? And so my grandfather, all the money he had saved in his time in the United States, he left it in Japan. Because number one, he couldn't convert it back to dollars because it was, you know, 1/300th of what it was before. And, you know, and plus he had 2 daughters in Japan, he might as well just leave it for them. So, anyway, but yeah, that was a huge setback. But, you know, it's the motivation that my dad had. You know, the last 15 years that we operated as a farm, we didn't have any loans. We didn't have any production loans. We operated on our own cash. And my dad was really proud of that he didn't have to answer to a bank. They managed cash so well that in 1971, we were approached by the Richards family, who used to run Glorietta and a co-op in Sacramento. They used to notice that we didn't ask for our money, our tomato money, in December like everybody else. We would tell them to defer it into January on some years, right? So they figured we had money. And this is 71, right? And so they approached us to invest. And so my dad and my uncle made their first major investment outside of farming. And that turned out to be Sunrise Mall in Sacramento. And we were part of Sunrise Mall Associates. I mean, we weren't really big. We were maybe like a 12% interest in half. And you know, but over the years, it did pretty well. You know, we sold it in 2007.
Yes.
And you know, and yeah, it was by far one of the best investments we had made. And you know, I share this with you because, you know, it's funny, my wife used to run a dry cleaners in Elk Grove. And one of our family friends, the wife of one of my dad's friends, childhood friends, used to work for her. And one day she tells Jeannie, she goes, you know, the Nishikawas were lucky. They made their money in gas and oil. And you know, and my wife, being the loyal wife that she is, she goes, oh, you know, I really don't know. My husband doesn't really talk much about their business. And you know, but later on she tells me about this. And I was sitting there going, really? Is that what people think? I said, no, it's from just blood, sweat, and tears of working the ground and saving money. That's how we make money. Mm-hmm. It was cutting out the middleman as much as we could, you know. And you know, my cousin David was our shop manager, and he would complain that he'd have to work so hard to keep our tractors running, because my dad would go off to these auctions and he'd buy up, you know, these cheap junky tractors. And my poor cousin had, and I used to think it was funny because, you know, I look at other farmers and they all have, you know, all nice John Deere tractors. They're all new. They're painted the same color. They're numbered, and you know, we had an International and a couple of John Deeres, and you know, and it was just a mishmash of stuff. But that's how we operated, because they didn't care. My dad didn't care what it looked like, just whether or not I got the job done, right? And, you know, I mean, that's probably why I drive a Ford Explorer. I mean, I don't care. I don't care.
Still gets you there.
It's not anything that's important. But. Yeah, Jeff.
So this isn't a.
Are you going to correct something?
No, this is not a planned question. But did your uncle and father have anything to do with the cannery? That's a major thing that I see as I go back and forth on the yellow bypass. Did the Nishikawas have anything to do with that cannery? That's a cannery, isn't it? That big structure, just to the, as you're heading towards West Sac, it's just to the right as you just before you get on the.
Gotham Green? You mean? Gotham Green?
No.
That's not a cannery?
No, that's not
okay.
cannery.
All these years I thought it was a cannery. What is that?
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
You can't miss it. It's a huge structure.
Oh.
It's as you get on the yellow bypass from Dixon.
From Dixon.
Yeah, from that direction, and you're heading towards Sacramento. Right before you get onto the bypass, you know where the bats are? Yeah. Off to the right there, there's a huge structure.
Yeah, it's a greenery. Yeah.
Cargo greenery.
Okay,
That's greenery. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
The rice down.
No, before it's
Before
Port of Sacramento.
Wait, before you get on the bypass.
Yes, Mrs. McDonald.
So, right, my former Cub Scout did a great job here. All right. Did you ever work in the farm in the summertime during college or high school? You did, yeah.
Of course. You know, the last summer I worked for the family, I worked in the year after my freshman year at Davis. And, you know, because, you know, being the contrary teenager I was, I used to joke with my dad that, you know, I recognize a lot of our employees, and I think they like working for us because, you know, we're union. And, you know, I think maybe that isn't retention good, Dad? Isn't that a good thing? And my dad would just shake his head and just be like, I could get, you know, people to do this for $3.25. And, you know, I mean, it would drive him crazy. That we would have to pay for benefits, pay for retirement. You know, so, you know, but yeah, but his solace was that he could pay me top union wage, and and I'd pay, I'd be paying taxes in my bracket, and he could write it off in his bracket. So he was all excited about that. So yeah, no, he did make all of us work. I used to actually turn in time cards, and I'd work 60-hour weeks. My sisters would turn in time cards, but maybe they worked for a week, got paid for a month. I always joked about that. I was like, how come I have to go out here and work every day? My dad was big into making you start from the bottom. He used to always say that, one day if you have to tell someone how to do this and you don't know how to do it, you got to learn. And so yeah, I used to have to do the most menial, silliest, dumbest. I couldn't even figure out what he was making me do half the time. But but yeah, I had to work. And like I said, my last summer, I remember talking to one of our employees, and he was telling me that, that he was trying to save money to buy a house. And all I could think about was, I'm barely gonna have enough money to last me the whole year to buy beer. And you're gonna buy a house on this? And so it was very enlightening to me. And I realized that, the difference between this guy and me is that I have an opportunity to go to college, and maybe I can do something else, So yeah, that was a very important lesson and a very, very important part of growing up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a couple questions.
What's that?
The reason why they picked on your dad in Utah and Heroes farming operation was because they were the most successsul, and the United Farm Workers Organization set their sights on you.
Yeah.
So thank you for taking the bullet. And the other, let's see, I used to see your dad, Utah, I always call him Utah.
Everyone called him Utah.
Utah. And him and the Satos, who were in the 242nd, would always have...
He was in the 440.
Huh?
Saitos were in the 440.
442nd.
Yes.
I said 442nd. Yeah.
Yes.
They were in it, and they would always eat at a restaurant. I can't remember the name of it, but I'd join them, and they allowed anybody to come in. We had the most wonderful lunches.
They'd always eat over at A&W.
It was
Yeah.
It was over here on Erie Lane, I think.
Well, I remember eating lunch with the Saitos at A&W.
Okay, maybe that was it, but they moved around.
And believe me, I would just have to sit there and listen to these guys talk shop about, I don't know what they're talking about.
But they're always enjoyable to talk to. And another thing, now, your dad, I know the Nishikawa brothers invested well. I was told, and I believe it's true, that as you crossed the Tower Bridge on M Street, did you build a big high-rise for commercial building there?
No.
Oh, then that was a lie.
We do own an office building in downtown Sacramento, but it's not
It's not after you cross the
it's
tower.
not that one.
Okay.
And and I'll tell you something. My dad, we successfully split Nishikawa Farms in 2001. My uncle died in '96. In '96 is when I was asked to come back to the farm. So I had 5 years away from the family, and those were the best 5 years of my life. And but I was asked to come back. My dad was pretty broken up because after all, Hiro was only 72, and my grandfather died at 72 as well. And, you know, so when my dad turned 72, you can just imagine how weird he acted that year. But he said to me, you know, I could die tomorrow and no one will know what's going on. And, you know, and this was very unfortunate for me because I had spent 5 years away and I had a better idea of what my worth was. So I wasn't just working for the family. You know, my cousin David, my cousin Jerry worked for the family right out of college. And I don't think they ever really established their worth. And plus they're dealing with my dad and uncle who are in their 40s and, you know, they knew better. And, you know, so it was the classic, you know, second generation issues. You know, they're not working hard enough. They don't care. They don't respect us. They don't listen to us. They, you know, they don't appreciate what we do, right? I heard that growing up. Being the youngest, I heard it all. And I used to always think, you know, God, if I just got these 4 people in the same room together, we could hash this thing out. But, you know, it was something else. And I wanted nothing to do with it. But, you know, things changed. You know, my uncle died. My uncle died suddenly. I had called him that morning and asked him if he wanted to go golfing. And he told me that he had a doctor's appointment and he wasn't feeling good. And the last thing I said to him was, well, we could golf anytime. Take care of yourself. And then later that afternoon, I get a frantic call from my wife, and she tells me he died. And they even, you know, they even waited. The whole family were at Woodland Memorial Hospital in the ER. The whole family's there, and they're waiting for me to get there because they couldn't get a hold of me. They couldn't get a hold of me all afternoon. And when they finally got a hold of me, I got there, and then we had a bedside service for my uncle. But and that's when everything changed, because, you know, that's when you realize that, you know, no one's going to be in charge of your own family's affairs better than you. And, you know, and that's when I changed my focus. And I realized this was my responsibility. Even though you're told this your whole life, you never realize when it would happen, why. You know, most of the time I wanted to avoid it because it was just, it's family. It's crazy. My family's crazy, right? They're just cousins. They can walk away. God. Anyway. But, yeah. Anyway. Yes?
Quickly tell us what your 3 sisters are doing. I'm kind of interested
My
in that.
3 sisters?
Yes.
Brenda is a pediatrician. She lives in Honolulu, Hawaii with her husband, who's a OBGYN. They have 3 kids. My sister Elaine lives in Vancouver, Washington. Her and her husband, her husband's been retired since he was 45, that guy. They spend most of their time playing in 3 different jazz bands up there. They have 3 kids. I mean, you know, my family, we were you know, we were considered, you know, high achievers because 2 of my sisters went to Stanford. My sister Elaine, all 3 of her kids went to Stanford, and 2 of her son-in-law and her sister-in-law went to Stanford too, or daughter-in-law went to Stanford too. So they're complete Stanford family. It's amazing. My sister Suzanne lives in Davis. She's married, has 2 kids. Her husband's a retired teacher, and my sister is my CFO. So she's CFO for Nishikawa Farms. Even though she does not have an accounting degree, she loves to tell me that. And she keeps an eye on me. So, anyway, but yeah, that's what my sisters are up to. Yeah. So there are 11 grandkids. One of them is here. And my son, Ryan, you could say he's Yutaka the third, because my middle name is Yutaka. And of course I had to name my oldest son after my father as well. Which is why if I brought family pictures from him when he was a little kid, he's always by my dad. And that was something that he was very, very proud of. Anything else? So, yeah, my dad would always say, because the vote was like 50-50, it was not a clear cut, everyone wants to go to the union. And my dad would have fought it tooth and nail.
Yeah.
But we were told it would cost like $100,000 in legal fees, right?
Well, the union picked on you because you were the biggest, most successful. Really, that was true.
And my uncle didn't want to fight it.
Yeah.
He didn't think it was worth it. My dad would have fought it to the end,
Yeah.
but he acquiesced and said, okay, we'll figure this out, and we'll still do okay. But yeah, I grew up.
Yeah.
I grew up hearing this my whole life. I'm not a big pro-union guy, by the way. Anyway, thank you very much. I do want to thank the Historical Society. Thank you very much for asking me to be here. I think it's quite appropriate that you guys have tomatoes out there. I will tell you this: growing up, I didn't like tomatoes. I didn't like them at all. But my dad, I did like ketchup and spaghetti sauce and all that kind of stuff, which is really what we grew. We grew production cannery tomatoes. We didn't grow fresh tomatoes. Anyway, so thank you.
Good job.